Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really complex and honestly pretty charged issue that's unfolding in Canada, this clash between Indigenous land claims and private property rights. We're going to break down a perspective that asks a very challenging question. So, the perspective we're examining today kicks things off with this question, and it's a doozy. It takes this massive national debate and brings it right down to your front door. Could you actually need someone else's permission to sell your own home? It's meant to make this whole thing feel really personal. So let's dig into why. And, this isn't just some abstract legal question. Here's a quote from a resident in Richmond, British Columbia. This person has lived in his home since 1975, and now he says his lender is flat out refusing to renew his mortgage. His story is really the launchpad for this entire discussion. Okay, so Section 1, a new property question. We're looking at the court case that's changing the landscape. So what is going on here? What's causing all this uncertainty? Well, according to the source material, it all boils down to one specific BC Supreme Court ruling that involves the Cowichan tribes. And the argument is that this single decision has completely upended the rules for property owners. Okay, so this really gets to the legal heart of the matter. On one hand, you've got what's called fee simple title. Now, that's just the legal term for how most of us in Canada own our homes. It's supposed to give you the most rights possible over your property. But then, on the other hand, you have Aboriginal title. This is an inherent right to the land, based on traditional use long before the Crown showed up, and it's protected in the Constitution. The big argument in the source material is that this court case has basically put these two fundamental rights on a collision course. And look, this court decision isn't just some theoretical thing. It has immediate, real-world impacts. The court granted Aboriginal title to the Cowichan over an area in Richmond that, well, it already has private homes, farms, even a golf course on it. Now, here's the kicker, the really stunning claim from the source. It alleges that because of this, landowners there now need to get consent from the Cowichan Nation just to sell their own property. And to make things even more complicated, the Cowichan Nation is actually appealing the decision because they believe their title should cover an even bigger area. All right, Section 2, the economic domino effect. We're going to follow the financial fallout here because this legal uncertainty, as you can imagine, is apparently creating a major chill in the economy. The video we're examining shows it's not just homeowners feeling the pinch, it's like a domino effect that's starting to topple parts of the commercial sector. And it starts with some pretty big examples. First up, $100 million. That's the value of a planned manufacturing facility in Richmond. A city councilor who's featured in the video says the company owned the land, they were ready to go, but they were denied a loan. The reason the bank gave? All the uncertainty swirling around this land title ruling. And that wasn't just a one-off. The source points to another, even bigger project that completely fell apart. We're talking about a $350 million commercial development. The company behind it said their lender backed out, a major tenant walked away, and they pointed the finger directly at the, quote, uncertainties and risk allocation issues that this court ruling created. Okay, Section 3, who claims what? This is where we look at the complex map of overlapping territories. So, to really get a sense of how big this issue could get, the source material zooms out from Richmond to look at the entire country. The argument is that what's happening in BC could just be the beginning. So the source explains that, historically, the way you got legal certainty about who owned what in Canada was through treaties, right? These are constitutionally recognized agreements between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. They're formal, they lay out specific rights to land and resources, and they create clear rules. But, and this is a huge but, vast parts of the country were never actually covered by these treaties. Yeah, and we're talking about significant areas here. A huge chunk of British Columbia, large parts of Quebec, bits of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Northern Territories. Because these areas lack those historical treaties, it has created what one person in the video calls a legal vacuum. Basically, instead of having established agreements, ownership is now being battled out in the courts. And this is where it gets, well, really complicated. The source describes it as a mess. Because without treaties, you have these overlapping historical claims. In a place like Richmond, for example, the video shows maps where multiple First Nations have traditional claims over the exact same piece of land. And the source even claims that this uncertainty has opened the door for First Nations based in the United States to start making claims on Canadian land. All right, let's move on to Section 4, following the money. We're going to look at spending, accountability, and compensation. So with all these complex claims as the backdrop, The source then shifts gears and starts looking at the financial side of all this. It starts to ask some tough questions about federal spending and the financial accountability of some First Nations leadership. Okay, so citing a report from the Fraser Institute, the video lays out these numbers. Between 2015 and 2021, federal spending on Indigenous services nearly tripled, from $11 billion to $32 billion, a huge increase. But in that same time frame, the Community Well-Being Index, which measures quality of life for First Nations, only went up by 4 points. And that disparity leads the source to ask a pretty direct question: where is all that money actually going? So to try and answer that question, the video digs into publicly available financial records, and it highlights this one really specific case. It's a band with an on-reserve population of just one person. But according to the documents shown, the chief and council's salaries and expenses cost taxpayers almost $500,000 a year. The perspective being presented here is that these examples aren't just isolated incidents, but maybe part of a wider systemic problem. The source brings up a past case where a chief was found to be making over $900,000 in 1 year. It also claims that a policy change back in 2015 made it so First Nations no longer had to publicly disclose their finances, leading to less transparency. And then it points to a band in Quebec that's currently seeking $5 billion in a land claim, but according to the video, hasn't posted its own financial statements for the last 2 years. So this brings us to the final section, Section 5, Canada at a Crossroads. Because at the end of the day, the source material argues that what Canada is facing here is a fundamental conflict. It's not just about one court case or financial accountability. It's about two foundational principles of the country that are now on a collision course. Yeah, and this quote from the source really just sums up the whole tension perfectly. Private property is the foundation of our economy. It's a foundation, quite frankly, of our society. And right now, that is being put in question because of this court case. So the argument is that you have these constitutionally protected Indigenous rights on one side, and they are now smashing up against the principle of private property, which the speaker calls the very foundation of Canadian society and the economy. So the source doesn't really offer up an easy solution here. It doesn't tell us what to do. Instead, it leaves us, the viewers, with this really provocative question, framing this whole thing as a defining challenge for the country's future. And that question is, when two foundational principles, constitutionally protected Indigenous rights and the security of private property, collide, what is the path forward?